How iPhone's software focus killed Motorola's hardware reign. The phone company that invented mobile communication forgot that hardware without software is just plastic. This is the story of how Motorola, the undisputed king of mobile hardware for over 3 decades, watched their empire crumble in just 7 years because they failed to understand that the future of phones wasn't about making better radios, it was about creating better experiences. When the iPhone launched in 2007, Motorola controlled nearly 23% of the global mobile phone market and had revenues exceeding $36 billion. By 2014, their mobile division had been sold to Google for $12.5 billion and then immediately flipped to Lenovo for just $2.9 billion, marking one of the most spectacular corporate collapses in technology history. But this wasn't a story of a company that got blindsided overnight. This was a story of institutional arrogance, cultural rigidity, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what smartphones were destined to become. Motorola didn't just lose market share. They lost relevance so completely that an entire generation of consumers grew up never knowing that the company synonymous with mobile phone even existed. Motorola's dominance in mobile communications wasn't accidental. It was earned through 40 years of relentless innovation and engineering excellence. The company invented the first handheld cellular phone in 1973, when engineer Martin Cooper made the first mobile phone call using the DynaTAC 8000X, a device that weighed 2.5 pounds and cost nearly $4,000 in 1983 money. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Motorola built the infrastructure that made mobile communication possible, holding over 1,400 patents related to cellular technology and manufacturing the chips, antennas, and base stations that powered the entire industry. Their engineering culture was legendary. They pioneered digital signal processing, created the first commercial digital cellular system, and developed manufacturing processes that made mobile phones affordable for consumers worldwide. The company's crown jewel was the RAZR flip phone, launched in 2004, which became the best-selling flip phone in history with over 130 million units sold. The RAZR was everything Motorola did best, impossibly thin at just 13.9 millimeters, beautifully engineered with an aluminum body, and featuring call quality that was simply unmatched by competitors. By 2006, the RAZR single-handedly generated over $10 billion in revenue for Motorola and represented the absolute pinnacle of what a mobile phone could be. The device was so successful that fashion magazines featured it in photo shoots, celebrities carried it as a status symbol, and competitors spent years trying to copy its industrial design. But Motorola's hardware obsession, which had been their greatest strength, was about to become their fatal weakness. The company's engineering culture was built around radio frequency optimization, antenna design, and manufacturing efficiency, skills that had served them well in an era when phones were primarily communication devices. Their R&D spending focused almost entirely on improving call quality, extending battery life, and making phones smaller and more durable. In 2006, Motorola spent over $4 billion on research and development, but less than 8% of that budget was allocated to software development. The company's software teams were treated as an afterthought, tasked with creating simple menu systems and basic applications that would showcase the hardware's capabilities. Motorola's phones ran proprietary operating systems that were optimized for performance and battery life, but were nearly impossible for third-party developers to work with. The company's leadership, dominated by hardware engineers and manufacturing experts, genuinely believed that consumers chose phones based on technical specifications, build quality, and brand reputation. They saw software as a necessary evil, something that had to exist to make the hardware functional, but not something that would ever drive purchase decisions. This mindset wasn't just cultural, it was structural. Motorola's organization chart placed software engineers several levels below hardware designers. Their compensation systems rewarded patent creation over user experience innovation, and their product development cycle was built around hardware refresh schedules that took 18 to 24 months from concept to market. When Steve Jobs unveiled the iPhone on January 9, 2007, Motorola's initial reaction was dismissive, bordering on contemptuous. Ed Zander, Motorola's CEO at the time, famously told investors that Apple had created a nice toy, but that real phone customers cared about reliability, call quality, and battery life, not playing games and surfing the web. Internally, Motorola engineers conducted teardown analyses of the first iPhone and concluded that Apple had made fundamental compromises that would limit the device's appeal to serious users. The iPhone's battery life was significantly shorter than the RAZR's, its reception quality was inferior in weak signal areas, and its touchscreen interface was seen as a gimmick that would frustrate users trying to dial numbers or send text messages. Motorola's product teams were already working on their response. A new generation of RAZR phones with slightly larger screens, improved cameras, and music playback capabilities that would combine the reliability of their hardware platform with just enough software features to match Apple's offering. The company's market research, conducted in late 2007, showed that 73% of mobile phone users prioritized call quality and battery life over internet browsing and application downloading. Based on this data, Motorola doubled down on their hardware-centric strategy, launching the RAZR 2 series with thinner profiles, better cameras, and improved build quality, while keeping their proprietary software platform essentially unchanged. The market's response to this strategy was swift and devastating. iPhone sales reached 1.4 million units in the first quarter after launch, and more importantly, customer satisfaction scores were unlike anything the mobile industry had ever seen. Apple wasn't just selling phones. They were selling an entirely new category of device that made traditional mobile phones feel obsolete overnight. The iPhone's software-centric design meant that the device actually got better over time through software updates, something that was impossible with Motorola's hardware-focused approach. When Apple launched the App Store in July 2008, they created an ecosystem that transformed phones from communication devices into computing platforms. Within 6 months, the App Store had generated over 300 million downloads, proving that consumers were hungry for software experiences that went far beyond making calls and sending texts. Meanwhile, Motorola's RAZR 2 series was failing catastrophically in the marketplace. Despite superior build quality and better call performance, the devices felt ancient compared to the iPhone's touchscreen interface and internet capabilities. By Q4 2008, Motorola's mobile division posted a loss of $1.2 billion, their first quarterly loss in over a decade. The company's stock price dropped from a high of $27 per share in 2006 to just $3.86 by the end of 2008, wiping out over $20 billion in shareholder value. More troubling was the demographic data. Customers weren't just choosing iPhones over Motorola phones, they were switching to an entirely different relationship with mobile technology that made Motorola's value proposition irrelevant. Recognizing the existential threat they faced, Motorola attempted a dramatic pivot towards software-centric design, but their efforts were too little, too late, and undermined by the very organizational culture that had made them successful. In early 2009, the company announced their intention to abandon proprietary operating systems and embrace Google's Android platform, reasoning that partnering with Google would allow them to focus on hardware while leveraging best-in-class software. Their first Android device, the Motorola Click, launched in October 2009 with significant fanfare and a marketing budget exceeding $100 million. But the ClickQ revealed just how deeply Motorola misunderstood the software game they were now forced to play. The device shipped with a heavily customized version of Android called Motoblur that was designed to showcase Motorola's hardware capabilities rather than provide a superior user experience. Motoblur was slow, buggy, and confusing. It took over 30 seconds to boot up, frequently crashed when running multiple applications, and featured a user interface that tech reviewers described as actively hostile to human beings. More fundamentally, Motorola's software team lacked the expertise to optimize Android for their hardware platform. The ClickQ suffered from memory management issues, poor battery optimization, and software bugs that made basic functions like email and web browsing unreliable. When Google released Android 2.0 just weeks after the ClickQ's launch, Motorola was unable to provide an upgrade path, leaving customers stuck with obsolete software on devices they had just purchased. The company's struggles with software development weren't just technical, they were philosophical and organizational. Motorola's hardware engineers, who had controlled product development for decades, actively resisted the shift towards software-centric design because it threatened their status within the company. Internal documents from this period reveal a corporate culture in open revolt, with hardware teams refusing to collaborate with software developers and product managers caught between competing visions of what Motorola phones should become. The company's traditional product development cycle, optimized for hardware innovation, proved completely incompatible with software development practices. While Apple and Google were releasing software updates every few months, Motorola's approval processes required 8 to 12 months to implement even minor software changes. Their quality assurance procedures, designed around hardware reliability testing, were inadequate for evaluating software user experience, leading to devices that passed all technical specifications but were frustrating and confusing for actual users. By 2010, Motorola's customer satisfaction scores had dropped to industry lows, with over 40% of users reporting that they would not consider purchasing another Motorola device. The company's retail partnerships began to deteriorate as carriers like Verizon and AT&T reduced floor space allocation for Motorola products in favor of iPhones and Samsung Android devices that customers actually wanted to buy. Motorola's final attempt at relevance came with the 2011 launch of the Droid RAZR, a device that perfectly encapsulated both the company's engineering brilliance and their fundamental misunderstanding of the smartphone market. The Droid RAZR was a technical masterpiece. At just 7.1 millimeters thick, it was thinner than the iPhone 4S, featured a gorgeous Kevlar fiber back panel, and delivered battery life that exceeded most competing smartphones. The device showcased everything Motorola knew how to do well: precision manufacturing, materials innovation, and radio frequency optimization that provided excellent call quality and data performance. But the Droid RAZR also shipped with an outdated version of Android, a confusing user interface overlay, and a software experience that felt years behind Apple's iOS and Google's own Nexus devices. Reviews were universally mixed. Technology journalists praised the hardware design while lamenting the software experience that made the device frustrating to use for anything beyond basic phone functions. More damaging was the upgrade situation. When Google released Android 4.0 Ice Cream Sandwich, Motorola took over 8 months to provide an update for Droid RAZR users. And even then, the update was buggy and removed several features that users had come to rely on. Sales were disappointing, moving fewer than 2 million units in the crucial holiday quarter, despite massive marketing spending and prominent placement in Verizon stores. The smartphone market had fundamentally changed in ways that made Motorola's core competencies irrelevant, and the company's leadership was slow to recognize that their competitive advantages had become competitive disadvantages almost overnight. By 2012, consumers were choosing smartphones based on app ecosystems, software features, and user experience rather than call quality, build materials, or technical specifications. Apple's iPhone had created a new category where software capabilities determined hardware success, and Google's Android platform had enabled manufacturers like Samsung and HTC to compete on software innovation rather than just hardware engineering. Motorola found themselves competing in a market where their decades of expertise in radio design, antenna optimization, and manufacturing efficiency were table stakes rather than differentiators. Worse, their hardware-centric organizational structure made them inherently slower and less adaptable than competitors who had built their companies around software development cycles. While Apple could improve their phones dramatically through iOS updates, and competitors could differentiate through software features and user interface innovations, Motorola was locked into 18-month hardware development cycles that couldn't keep pace with the rapid evolution of smartphone software. The company's patent portfolio, once their most valuable asset, provided little protection against competitors who were winning through superior software execution rather than hardware innovation. Their manufacturing expertise, which had given them cost advantages in the flip phone era, became a liability when consumers were willing to pay premium prices for better software experiences regardless of build quality or materials. Google's $12.5 billion acquisition of Motorola Mobility in May 2012 was widely interpreted as a rescue mission, but it was actually a patent acquisition disguised as a hardware play. Google needed Motorola's 17,000 mobile patents to defend Android against lawsuits from Apple and Microsoft, not their manufacturing capabilities or brand recognition. The acquisition price seemed generous until you realized that Google valued Motorola's patent portfolio at approximately $12 billion, meaning they were getting the entire hardware business for just $500 million. Under Google's ownership, Motorola attempted one final reinvention with the Moto X, launched in August 2013 as a designed-by-you smartphone that would combine Google's software expertise with Motorola's hardware engineering. The Moto X featured innovative customization options, allowing users to choose colors, materials, and engravings through an online design studio, and included genuinely useful software features like always-on voice commands and smart notifications. But the market had moved on. Samsung had established themselves as the primary alternative to Apple, controlling over 30% of the global smartphone market through aggressive marketing and rapid product iteration. Chinese manufacturers like Xiaomi and Huawei were offering flagship quality devices at dramatically lower prices, competing on value rather than brand heritage. Most tellingly, consumers under 25 showed virtually zero brand recognition for Motorola, having grown up in an era where smartphones meant iPhone, Samsung Galaxy, or various Android alternatives. The Moto X sold fewer than 500,000 units in its first quarter, making it one of the biggest product launches failures in smartphone history. When Google sold Motorola's hardware division to Lenovo for $2.9 billion in January 2014, it marked the end of one of the most dramatic corporate collapses in technology history. A company that had invented mobile communication, dominated the industry for over 3 decades, and generated hundreds of billions in revenue, had been reduced to a patent portfolio and a failing hardware business worth less than many tech startups. The sale price represented just 23% of what Google had paid less than 2 years earlier, and Lenovo was primarily interested in Motorola's brand name for international markets rather than their technology or manufacturing capabilities. Motorola's mobile division, which had employed over 20,000 people at its peak, was down to fewer than 3,500 employees, most of whom were laid off during the transition to Lenovo ownership. The company's research and development facilities in Illinois, which had produced breakthrough innovations in cellular technology, digital signal processing, and mobile device design, were closed or converted to other purposes. Most of Motorola's engineering talent had already been recruited by Apple, Google, Samsung, and other companies that understood the central importance of software in defining mobile device success. The Motorola brand, once synonymous with mobile communication reliability and innovation, became a budget smartphone label focused primarily on emerging markets where price mattered more than features or software experience. This wasn't just a business failure. It was a complete cultural extinction, the disappearance of a company whose innovations had created the entire mobile industry, but whose inability to evolve had made them irrelevant in the world they had helped create. The destruction of Motorola's mobile empire offers lessons that extend far beyond the smartphone industry, revealing how quickly technological leadership can become technological irrelevance when companies mistake their current advantages for permanent competitive moats. Motorola's engineers were among the most talented in the world, their manufacturing processes were industry-leading, and their patent portfolio represented decades of genuine innovation. But none of these advantages mattered when the market shifted from valuing hardware performance to software experience, and the company's organizational culture prevented them from adapting to this new reality. The iPhone didn't kill Motorola through superior engineering or better manufacturing. It killed them by redefining what a phone could be and creating a software-centric ecosystem that made hardware specifications secondary to user experience. Apple understood that in a world where computing power was becoming commoditized, the real value would come from software that could harness that power in ways that delighted users and created emotional connections with technology. Motorola's tragedy wasn't that they made bad phones. Many of their devices were technically superior to early iPhones in measurable ways. Their tragedy was that they continued making phones in a world that had moved on to computing platforms, And by the time they recognized this shift, their competitors had already built ecosystems, developer communities, and user experiences that were impossible to replicate through hardware engineering alone. The phone company that invented mobile communication had forgotten that in the digital age, hardware without software isn't just plastic, it's irrelevant.